Have you ever wondered what dark secrets lie buried in the forgotten ledgers of America's past? What horrors were documented with cold precision by those who saw human beings as nothing more than property? Tonight, we uncover one such ledger from 1859 Georgia that reveals a terror so profound it challenges our understanding of human cruelty. Before we continue, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We need your support to keep uncovering these hidden histories that some would prefer remain buried forever. Subscribe now to help us continue sharing these untold stories. The leather-bound ledger was discovered in the summer of 2023, tucked away in a hidden compartment beneath the floorboards of the Blackwood Plantation Manor during renovations. The plantation had changed hands numerous times since the Civil War, eventually becoming a historical site managed by the Georgia Historical Society. The ledger belonged to Ephraim Blackwood, once one of the wealthiest plantation owners in Calhoun County, Georgia. What made this particular document stand out from the countless other plantation records was a disturbing pattern noted by historian Dr. Eliza Montgomery. When I first opened the ledger, I noticed something peculiar in the marriage records section, Dr. Montgomery later stated in her initial report. Blackwood had meticulously documented not only the forced pairings of enslaved individuals, but also what he called matrimonial reassignments, a euphemism for one of the most psychologically devastating practices I've encountered in my 20 years studying this period. The ledger revealed that Ephraim Blackwood had developed a systematic approach to breaking the will of enslaved people who showed any sign of resistance or who he deemed troublesome. He would deliberately separate married couples, selling them to different owners, or more disturbingly, forcing them to remarry others within his plantation. These separations and forced pairings were documented with chilling precision, sometimes accompanied by notes on the emotional state of the victims. The first entry that caught Dr. Montgomery's attention was dated February 12, 1859. Samuel and Mary showed excessive attachment, resulting in Samuel's refusal to work the additional hours required during harvest. Mary was reassigned to Jeremiah today at the Wilkinson County auction. Samuel's productivity to be closely monitored. Acquisition of new female, Esther from the Pemberton estate, to replace Mary. A week later, another entry followed. Samuel attempted escape. Recaptured near the Oconee River. Standard discipline administered. Informed Samuel of Mary's reassignment to the Jackson Plantation in South Carolina. Completed marriage ceremony between Samuel and Esther. Samuel remains uncooperative, but will adjust in time. As Dr. Montgomery and her team continued to analyze the document, they discovered that Blackwood's matrimonial reassignments were not isolated incidents, but part of a calculated system. Between 1854 and 1860, he had separated at least 37 married couples, documenting each case with disturbing detachment. The most haunting aspect was how he recorded his observations of the psychological impact. The dissolution of familial bonds continues to prove effective in maintaining order. Those who have experienced reassignment seldom attempt escape or show defiance again. The process breaks something essential in their character, leaving them more manageable. Further investigation into county records revealed that Ephraim Blackwood had developed a reputation among other plantation owners for his methods of controlling enslaved people without resorting to excessive physical punishment that might damage their capacity for labor. He had even written letters to neighboring plantation owners, advising them on his techniques. One such letter, found in the archives of the Savannah Historical Library, written to a Thomas Whitfield of Athens, stated, "My dear Whitfield, I have found that the lash, while occasionally necessary, often creates resentment that festers beneath the surface. A man may be beaten into submission, but his spirit remains intact. However, when you sever the bonds of the heart, you crush the very will to resist. I have perfected a system of matrimonial reassignment that accomplishes what the whip cannot. It breaks not the body, but the soul. In the winter of 1859, Blackwood's practices took an even more sinister turn. The ledger entries from November through December detail what he called the experiment, a methodical study of the effects of his separations. November 3rd, 1859. Began the experiment today. Selected 5 couples known to have strong attachments will reassign all 10 individuals to new partners at next month's auction in Augusta. Have prepared detailed observation sheets to document behavioral changes. This systematic approach should yield valuable insights for plantation management. December 7th, 1859. The Augusta auction was most productive. Successfully reassigned all subjects from the experiment. Particularly notable was the case of Isaac and Ruth, married 15 years with 3 children. Ruth displayed extreme distress upon separation, requiring restraint. Isaac became catatonic, showing no resistance. This dramatic contrast in response merits further study. Have placed Ruth with William, previously married to Hannah, and Isaac with Sarah, previously married to Josiah. December 21st, 1859. First observations from the experiment are promising. Isaac remains in a state of compliance bordering on absence, performs all tasks without hesitation, but speaks to no one. Ruth attempted self-harm twice, but now appears resigned. The children continue to ask for their parents, creating disruption. We'll consider separating them as well if this continues. The ledger contained folded papers with diagrams showing what appeared to be a systematic rotation of partners designed to destroy existing bonds and create a state of emotional detachment among the enslaved population. Blackwood had created a crude chart tracking what he called adjustment periods, the time it took for individuals to stop showing visible signs of distress after separation. What made these documents particularly disturbing to researchers was the evident pride Blackwood took in his methodology. Unlike many plantation records that treated enslaved people as mere inventory, Blackwood's notes revealed a calculated psychological warfare. He understood precisely the emotional damage he was inflicting and viewed it as an achievement. By early 1860, Blackwood's reputation had spread throughout the region. The ledger included letters from at least 7 other plantation owners seeking advice on implementing similar systems. One letter from a plantation owner in Augusta revealed the spreading influence of these practices. Your methods have revolutionized my approach to management. After implementing your matrimonial reassignment strategy with just 3 couples, I observed a marked decrease in resistance throughout my entire population. The mere threat of separation now ensures compliance. I would be most interested in purchasing your complete management journal should you ever consider publishing your techniques. Dr. Montgomery's research team managed to trace some of the separated families through post-Civil War Freedmen's Bureau records. What they discovered was heartbreaking evidence of the long-term trauma inflicted by Blackwood's practices. In 1866, a freedman named Samuel, believed to be the same Samuel mentioned in the early entries, placed an advertisement in the Christian Recorder, a newspaper widely read by formerly enslaved people searching for family. Seeking information on my wife Mary, separated from me at Wilkinson County Auction, Georgia, February 1859. Sold to a Mr. Wilkinson and reportedly taken to South Carolina. I am now a free man living in Atlanta. I have never stopped looking for you, Mary. Similar advertisements appeared throughout the Reconstruction era as freed people desperately tried to reunite with spouses and children who had been sold away. The Blackwood plantation's former residents placed more such advertisements than those from almost any other single plantation in Georgia, according to Freedmen's Bureau records. As Dr. Montgomery continued to study the ledger, she discovered a shift in Blackwood's entries beginning in late 1860. The impending Civil War had created uncertainty in the slave market. and Blackwood appeared concerned about the potential loss of his investment. His entries became more frantic, documenting hasty sales and transfers. January 18th, 1861. War seems increasingly likely. Have accelerated sales of troublesome individuals. The market is flooded with similar offerings as many planters in Georgia liquidate assets. Prices falling rapidly. The Adams family purchased 6 of our people at significantly reduced rates. Included in the sale was Esther, who has never fully adjusted to her pairing with Samuel. Her melancholy made her less useful in the house. The last pages of the ledger contained scattered notes about the early days of the Civil War. Blackwood's final entry was dated March 3rd, 1862. Union forces reportedly moving south have buried silver and valuables beneath the oak at the north corner of the property. Most of the remaining enslaved have been sent to our holdings in Alabama for safekeeping. Those deemed less valuable remain to maintain the plantation. Samuel among them. He has become entirely docile since Mary's departure, though occasionally found mumbling her name in his sleep, even after 3 years. A broken man makes a compliant worker, though less strong than before. Such is the necessary compromise. Dr. Montgomery's team found court records indicating that Ephraim Blackwood survived the Civil War, but lost most of his fortune. He died in 1873 in reduced circumstances, leaving behind only the plantation house and a small parcel of land, which was sold to pay debts. What happened to Samuel remains unclear. No further records of him have been found after the war. Whether he ever located Mary is unknown. The last trace of his existence was a partial record from the Freedmen's Bureau in 1867, which listed a Samuel, formerly of Blackwood Plantation, as having received assistance to travel to Charleston, South Carolina, perhaps continuing his search for Mary. The stories of countless others affected by Blackwood's cruel experiments largely vanished into history until the discovery of the ledger brought their suffering back into the light. As research continued into the ledger's contents, historians discovered connections to other plantations across Georgia and neighboring states. It became apparent that Blackwood's methods had influenced slave management practices beyond his own property, creating ripples of trauma that affected hundreds, perhaps thousands of lives. In April 2024, during an oral history project in the community surrounding the former Blackwood Plantation, researchers encountered an elderly woman named Dorothy Williams, whose great-great-grandparents had been enslaved at Blackwood. "My grandmother used to tell me stories her grandmother told her," Dorothy explained. "She said that people from Blackwood didn't just fear the whip. They feared the auction block in a different way. The master would tell them, 'Work hard and follow orders, or next month you'll have a new husband, a new wife.' It was like he was playing God, deciding who could love who." Dorothy shared a family story passed down through generations about a woman named Ruth, possibly the same Ruth mentioned in Blackwood's experiment. "The story goes that my great-great-grandmother, Ruth, was separated from her husband Isaac and paired with another man. She stopped speaking after that, just went silent. They say she never spoke another word for the rest of her life, even after freedom came. She would write things down when she needed to communicate, but her voice was gone. The family always said it wasn't that she couldn't speak, it was that something in her had died and words wouldn't come anymore." The oral histories collected from descendants revealed a pattern of intergenerational trauma. Many reported stories of ancestors who had difficulty forming attachments, who remained constantly fearful that loved ones would be taken away, or who developed elaborate systems to try to maintain family connections despite separation. One descendant shared letters written by his ancestor Jacob, who had been subjected to Blackwood's reassignments twice before escaping to Union lines in 1863. "Even now, as a free man, I cannot sleep through the night. I wake believing I hear the auctioneer's hammer and must check that my wife still lies beside me. Freedom has come, but the fear remains. They took Hannah from me and gave me to Rebecca. Then they took Rebecca and gave me to Sarah. Each time, a piece of my heart was torn away until I feared I had nothing left to give. Even now, I hold back something of myself, for to love completely is to risk a pain I cannot bear again. As Dr. Montgomery's research gained attention, other historians began examining records from neighboring plantations for evidence of similar practices. They discovered that while family separation was a common and devastating aspect of American slavery, Blackwood's systematic approach to using marriage reassignment specifically as psychological control appeared to be unusual in its calculated cruelty. Dr. James Richardson of Emory University, who joined the research team in 2024, found evidence that Blackwood's methods may have originated from his earlier career as a prison warden in North Carolina. Before acquiring Blackwood Plantation, Ephraim served as a warden at the Central Prison in Raleigh, Dr. Richardson explained. Records indicate he experimented with various forms of non-physical punishment to maintain control over prisoners. He wrote several essays on what he called the science of submission, breaking a person's will through psychological rather than physical means. When he later became a plantation owner, he appears to have refined these techniques. Archives from the North Carolina Historical Society contained an essay written by Blackwood in 1847 during his time as prison warden. I have observed that men can endure remarkable physical suffering while maintaining their defiance. The body may be confined, but the spirit remains free unless one discovers the chains that bind the soul itself. In my experience, these chains are invariably the bonds of affection. Sever these, and even the strongest man becomes malleable. This discovery suggested that Blackwood's cruelty was not merely casual sadism, but a deliberately developed system based on his observations of human psychology, a proto-scientific approach to breaking human will. As the research team continued their investigation in the summer of 2024, they made another disturbing discovery. In the basement of the Blackwood Manor, behind a false wall discovered during the ongoing renovations, they found a small room containing additional documents, what appeared to be Blackwood's personal journal, separate from the business ledger. The journal contained more intimate reflections on his methods, revealing a mind that viewed his actions not with remorse, but with cold fascination. June 15, 1859. Observed the reunion between Isaac and Ruth today, 6 months after their separation and reassignment to new partners, arranged for them to encounter each other while working in the same field, with instructions to overseers to allow a brief conversation while I observed from horseback. Most illuminating. They regarded each other as strangers might, with caution and distance. Ruth could not meet Isaac's eyes. Isaac addressed her as Ma'am, rather than by name. When Ruth mentioned their children, Isaac visibly flinched and changed the subject. My hypothesis appears correct. The reassignment process not only severs the original bond, but creates a wound so painful that the subjects will actively avoid reopening it. They choose to forget rather than remember what was lost. Fascinating. Another entry provided insight into how he selected couples for separation. The most effective subjects for reassignment are not those with casual attachments, but those with the deepest bonds. The greater the attachment, the more profound the breaking. This explains why Samuel continues to be resistant despite 3 years of separation from Mary. Their bond was unusually strong. In future selections, I will prioritize couples who have been together longest or who have multiple children. The breaking is more difficult, but ultimately more complete. Perhaps most chilling were entries that revealed Blackwood viewed himself not as cruel, but as scientific. I believe I have discovered a fundamental truth about human nature that few have systematically explored. The captivity of the body is merely physical, but the captivity of the heart enslaves the soul itself. In my management system, I have achieved what others have not. a form of ownership that extends beyond the legal framework of slavery to something more profound. I do not merely own their labor, I command their capacity for connection itself. The journal also revealed that Blackwood had kept detailed records of what he called breeding projects, forced pairings specifically intended to produce children with desired physical characteristics. These entries were clinical and devoid of any recognition of the humanity of those involved. September 10th, 1859. The pairing of Thomas, tall, strong, but prone to respiratory ailments, with Catherine, shorter, sturdy constitution, no history of illness, has produced a female child with promising characteristics. Will continue to monitor her development. If successful, will implement similar selective pairings. Have identified 12 potential matches based on physical and temperamental traits. Dr. Montgomery and her team were forced to take breaks during their analysis of these materials, finding the content psychologically taxing to engage with continuously. There were days when I couldn't continue reading, Dr. Montgomery later wrote in her journal. The calculated nature of the cruelty, documented so methodically, was overwhelming. What made it particularly difficult was recognizing that this was not the work of a monster in the conventional sense, but of a man who was respected in his community, who went to church on Sundays, who was considered a gentleman by his peers. It forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how systems of oppression normalize atrocity. As the research expanded, connections emerged between Blackwood's practices and persistent patterns in the communities descended from his plantation. Public health researchers noted that in the counties surrounding the former Blackwood properties, descendants of enslaved populations showed higher rates of certain psychological conditions, including attachment disorders, depression, and PTSD, compared to descendants of enslaved people from other regions. Dr. Tanya Wilson, a psychologist specializing in intergenerational trauma, began working with descendants who volunteered to participate in her study. What we're seeing suggests that severe psychological trauma like that inflicted by Blackwood separation practices doesn't just affect the immediate victims. It creates patterns of behavior and response that can be passed down through generations through both learned behavior and possibly epigenetic changes, Dr. Wilson explained. Many participants describe a persistent fear of abandonment, difficulty trusting romantic partners, or a tendency to emotionally detach when relationships become too intimate, without knowing why they feel this way. One participant in Dr. Wilson's study, a 58-year-old descendant of a couple separated under Blackwood's system, shared, "All my life, I've had this feeling that people I love will suddenly be taken away. I've sabotaged relationships when they got too close. I never understood why until I learned about my family history, about my great-great-grandparents who were forced apart and paired with others. Somehow, that fear has lived in our family for generations. It's like we inherited their wounds without knowing the cause." As the research attracted media attention, more descendants came forward with family stories and artifacts. One family possessed a small handmade cloth doll passed down through generations with a story attached. According to family tradition, an enslaved woman named Sarah at Blackwood Plantation had made matching dolls for herself and her husband Daniel before they were separated by Blackwood's reassignment policy. They each kept their doll hidden as a secret reminder of their true spouse, even when forced to marry others. The story claimed that after emancipation, Sarah spent 7 years searching for Daniel, carrying her doll with her. When they finally reunited in 1872, they recognized each other by the matching dolls they still carried. The family believed that this small act of resistance, keeping these tokens of their true marriage, had helped them maintain their connection, despite Blackwood's attempts to sever it. Other artifacts emerged, hidden love letters, small tokens exchanged as promises to find each other again, coded messages sent through intermediaries. These represented the countless ways enslaved people had resisted Blackwood's psychological warfare, finding means to maintain their human connections despite his systematic attempts to destroy them. But not all stories had such hopeful elements. Many family histories told of ancestors who never found their separated spouses, who died still searching, or who were so traumatized by the experience that they never formed close relationships again. Dr. Montgomery's research team worked to create a database of separated families, hoping to help descendants connect pieces of their family histories. The project, named Broken Bonds, used the information from Blackwood's ledger alongside other plantation records, Freedmen's Bureau documents, and family histories to trace the paths of separated spouses and children. In some cases, they were able to connect living descendants whose ancestors had been separated by Blackwood's policies, people who never knew they shared a family history severed by the auction block. These emotional reunions of family lines that had been deliberately broken apart generations ago became a form of healing, a reclaiming of connections that Blackwood had tried to permanently destroy. As the research continued into the fall of 2024, disturbing patterns began to emerge that suggested Blackwood's influence extended beyond his death. Correspondence found in various historical archives revealed that in the years following the Civil War, Ephraim Blackwood had maintained connections with former overseers and other plantation owners who admired his methods. Even after emancipation made his specific practices illegal, Blackwood appeared to have adapted his psychological techniques to the new reality. A letter dated 1870 from Blackwood to a former associate in Louisiana contained troubling passages. While our former management systems have been rendered obsolete by unfortunate political developments, the underlying principles remain sound and applicable. The control of labor continues to depend upon psychological, rather than merely physical dominance. My experiments with separated families have proven that the threat of losing access to loved ones remains effective even when direct ownership is no longer permitted. The letter went on to describe how Blackwood had reorganized his greatly reduced plantation operations after the war. He now employed former slaves as tenant farmers, but structured their contracts and housing arrangements to maintain control over family units, using the threat of eviction, which would separate families, as leverage to demand unfavorable terms. I have found that merely suggesting that a troublesome tenant's children might need to find different arrangements if productivity doesn't improve tends to resolve most disputes in my favor. The memory of separation remains powerful. This revelation suggested that Blackwood had helped establish some of the exploitative patterns that would characterize the sharecropping and tenant farming systems that kept many formerly enslaved people in conditions of near slavery for generations after emancipation. Dr. Montgomery's team also discovered connections between Blackwood and early members of organizations that would later evolve into hate groups during the Reconstruction era. His techniques of psychological control appeared in manuals circulated among these groups, adapted to maintain racial hierarchies through terror rather than legal ownership. By October 2024, the research had expanded to examine how these psychological tactics might have influenced broader systems of control throughout American history. Historians began identifying similar patterns in various institutional settings, from certain prison management techniques to methods used in some company towns and mining operations well into the 20th century. As one historian noted in their analysis, Blackwood didn't invent family separation as a control tactic. It was widespread throughout American slavery. But what makes his case significant is how he systematized it, studied it, and deliberately spread these methods to others. He represents an important link in understanding how psychological techniques of control evolved and persisted in different forms long after slavery ended. The ledger and associated documents were eventually transferred to the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, where they became part of an exhibition on resistance and resilience in the face of deliberate attempts to destroy black family structures throughout American history. The exhibition highlighted not just the horrors documented in Blackwood's ledger, but also the many ways enslaved people resisted his attempts to break their bonds, from the secret tokens like Sarah's doll to the persistent searches for loved ones that continued for decades after emancipation, to the maintenance of family histories through oral tradition even when families were physically separated. In December 2024, as part of the museum's programming, a gathering of descendants took place. Among them was 93-year-old Margaret Johnson, believed to be the oldest living descendant of a couple separated by Blackwood's policies. Addressing the gathered crowd, her voice strong despite her age, Margaret shared, "My great-grandmother Rebecca used to tell me they tried to break us apart, but they didn't know we had souls that could find each other. They took her husband Thomas and gave her to another man, but she never stopped loving Thomas. After freedom came, she searched for 7 years before finding him. And when she did, though both had been forced to marry others and had children with them, they recognized each other instantly. They couldn't be together again in the same way, but they settled their families near each other and remained connected for the rest of their lives." She paused, her eyes scanning the room filled with descendants. What Blackwood never understood was that love isn't something that can be erased by force. It goes underground, like a river flowing beneath the earth. It finds new paths. It endures. We are all proof of that endurance. We stand here today because our ancestors refused to let their connections die, refused to become what Blackwood wanted them to be. Soulless tools who could be paired and separated at his whim. Their resistance lives in us. The gathering became an annual event, a testimony to the failure of Blackwood's ultimate goal. He had sought to break human bonds permanently, to demonstrate his power to control not just bodies, but hearts. The coming together of descendants was living proof that he had failed. Yet as the research into Blackwood's ledger continued to expand, troubling questions remained. How many of his techniques had filtered into other systems of control throughout American history? How much of the intergenerational trauma experienced by descendants remained unrecognized and unhealed? And most disturbingly, were modern parallels to his method still at work in less visible ways? Dr. Montgomery reflected on these questions in the conclusion of her initial report on the ledger. What makes the Blackwood documents so disturbing is not just their documentation of cruelty in the past, but the questions they force us to ask about the present. When we understand how deliberately these psychological techniques of control were developed and disseminated, we must examine what legacies they have left in our institutions, our systems, and our patterns of thought. The ledger is not just a historical artifact, it's a mirror that reflects uncomfortable truths about how power has operated and continues to operate in American society. The investigation into the full impact of Ephraim Blackwood's matrimonial reassignments continues to this day. Researchers believe many affected families have yet to be identified, their stories still waiting to be uncovered and connected to this dark chapter of deliberately inflicted trauma. Meanwhile, in the small cemetery behind what was once the Blackwood Plantation Manor, a memorial was erected in 2025, bearing the names of all those identified in the ledger as victims of separation. The monument includes those whose subsequent fates remain unknown, the disappeared whose stories were cut short by Blackwood's cruelty. At the base of the memorial is an inscription taken from a letter found among Freedmen's Bureau records, written by a man named Isaac, believed to be the Isaac from Blackwood's experiment, to an agent helping him search for his first wife, Ruth. They tried to make us forget each other. They told me she was no longer my wife, that another man now called her his own, that I must accept a new wife of their choosing. They thought they could command our hearts as they commanded our bodies. But even when I spoke the words they forced upon me, even when I stood beside another woman and called her wife, in my soul I remained bound to Ruth. They owned our present, but they could not own our memory or our future. One day we will be truly free, and on that day we will find each other again. Whether Isaac and Ruth ever reunited remains unknown, but their resistance, their refusal to surrender their connection completely despite Blackwood's calculated efforts, represents the human spirit that his cruel experiments ultimately failed to break. Yet the ledger remains, its meticulous entries documenting a deliberate attempt to weaponize human connection as a tool of control. A dark chapter not just in the history of American slavery, but in the longer history of how power has operated upon the human heart. And some wonder, are there other ledgers still waiting to be discovered? Other systems of control whose full impact we have yet to recognize? The story of Blackwood's ledger continues to unfold, connecting past to present in ways that challenge us to recognize both historical trauma and ongoing legacies of control. As night falls over the former Blackwood Plantation, now a historical site and memorial, visitors sometimes report an unsettling feeling, as though the land itself remembers the pain inflicted there. Some claim to hear whispers on the wind, voices calling names across time, still searching for those taken away. Whether these are merely the projections of visitors confronting a difficult history or something more mysterious remains uncertain. But what is clear is that the bonds Blackwood tried to break continue to reconnect across time, through memory, through history, and through the descendants who carry both the trauma and the resilience of those who came before. The investigation into Blackwood's psychological torture system took an unexpected turn in January 2025, when Dr. Montgomery received an email from a private collector in Charleston, South Carolina. The collector, who wished to remain anonymous, claimed to possess additional documents related to Ephraim Blackwood that had been purchased at an estate auction in 1976. The materials I acquired include personal correspondence between Blackwood and several other prominent plantation owners across the South, the collector wrote. But what might interest you most is a second ledger, what Blackwood referred to as his continuation journal, documenting his activities from 1863 through 1871. After verifying the authenticity of these documents, Dr. Montgomery traveled to Charleston to examine them. What she discovered expanded the already disturbing narrative into even darker territory. The continuation journal revealed that as the Civil War progressed and Blackwood recognized that slavery might soon end, he began developing contingency plans to maintain control through other means. By 1863, he had transferred many of his enslaved people to his secondary property in Alabama, beyond the immediate reach of advancing Union forces, but he was already contemplating the post-war landscape. An entry from April 1863 read, "The conflict continues to progress unfavorably. While I maintain hope for our cause, prudence demands preparation for less favorable outcomes. Should the unthinkable occur and our property rights be infringed, I have consulted with Whitfield, Harrison, and Pemberton on strategies to maintain effective control through economic means rather than legal ownership. The psychological principles I have developed need not be abandoned, merely adapted to new circumstances." By 1865, with the Confederacy collapsing, Blackwood's entries became more urgent. He documented meetings with other plantation owners to develop what they called the New Management Framework, a series of economic and social control mechanisms designed to maintain white supremacy and control over black labor even after legal emancipation. May 12, 1865. Meeting held at Whitfield's estate with 12 like-minded gentlemen. Agreement reached on coordinated approach to the labor problem. We will establish consistent wage rates well below sustenance level to necessitate debt, implement strict vagrancy enforcement, and create a unified system of labor contracts and crop liens. Most significant was the consensus on family management. We will structure housing and employment to maintain our ability to separate troublesome families. The Reverend Caldwell assures us of scriptural justification for these measures that we may present to any who question our Christian charity in these arrangements. What emerged from these pages was evidence of a deliberate conspiracy to create what would become the sharecropping system, not as an organic economic development, but as a calculated replacement for slavery, designed specifically to maintain many of the same power dynamics. Most disturbing was how Blackwood adapted his psychological separation techniques to the new reality. No longer able to sell human beings, he instead developed contract terms that allowed him to evict and blacklist anyone who caused disruption, ensuring they would be separated from their families as effectively as if they had been sold. A chilling entry from October 1865 documented the first implementation of this strategy. Former slave Daniel, previously subjected to matrimonial reassignment in '59, emerged as potential leader among the workers, suggesting collective negotiation of terms, applied the separation principle immediately, evicted him alone while allowing his family to remain in their cabin, with clear understanding that any continued association with him would result in their eviction as well. Informed neighboring landowners of his troublesome nature, ensuring no employment within 20 miles. Effect on other workers was immediate and gratifying. All signed the presented contracts without further complaint. The journal revealed that Blackwood and his associates had systematically shared information about troublesome, formerly enslaved people, creating an informal blacklist that made it impossible for anyone who resisted their terms to find work within the region. This economic bondage effectively trapped many former slaves in exploitative arrangements where they remained vulnerable to the same psychological pressures Blackwood had perfected during slavery. But the journal also revealed something unexpected, evidence of resistance that had not been visible in the earlier ledger. As formerly enslaved people gained even limited freedom of movement, many used it specifically to search for family members who had been separated under Blackwood's system. Blackwood noted with evident frustration, the freed people expend unreasonable resources attempting to locate former attachments, often abandoning advantageous contracts to pursue rumors of separated spouses or children. This sentiment persists despite our best efforts to establish new family arrangements during their bondage. Harrison reports similar difficulties on his properties. We must develop more effective measures to discourage this practice as it undermines the stability of our labor force. These entries revealed that despite years of systematic separation and forced remarriage, many formerly enslaved people had maintained their original bonds in secret, remembering their true spouses and children and seizing the first opportunity to find them again. Dr. Montgomery's research team discovered corresponding records in Freedmen's Bureau documents, hundreds of inquiries from formerly enslaved people seeking information about family members who had been sold away or reassigned under Blackwood's system. These poignant searches, often continuing for years or decades after emancipation, testified to the failure of Blackwood's ultimate goal, the permanent breaking of family bonds. One particularly moving document was a letter written by a woman named Sarah to a Freedmen's Bureau agent in 1870. "I am searching for my true husband James, who was taken from Blackwood Plantation and sold in August 1857. Master Blackwood gave me to another man named Thomas after James was sold, but I never stopped being James's wife in my heart. I have saved $15 to place an advertisement in the Christian Recorder. Please help me word it properly as I cannot write well. I have waited 13 years to find him and will not stop until my last breath." Further investigation revealed that this Sarah had indeed placed her advertisement, and against all odds had eventually reunited with James in 1873. They had lived out their remaining years together in a small farming community in North Carolina, both having been forced into other marriages during slavery, but choosing to reunite when finally free to do so. As Dr. Montgomery delved deeper into the continuation journal, she discovered evidence of Blackwood's involvement with early iterations of white supremacist organizations during Reconstruction. He had applied his understanding of psychological control to these groups, advising them on tactics of intimidation that would have maximum impact while minimizing risk to themselves. An entry from March 1868 read, "Consultation with K Society on effective methods of discouragement, advised focus on community leaders rather than random targets." The separation principle applies equally well to communities as to families. Remove the connecting individuals, and the remaining structure becomes more malleable. Recommended demonstration actions that separate influential freedmen from their communities through intimidation rather than elimination, creating visible examples without creating martyrs. This evidence suggested that Blackwood had helped shape the terrorist tactics used by white supremacist groups during Reconstruction, applying the same cold calculation to community destruction that he had previously applied to family separation. In the years following the Civil War, Ephraim Blackwood had gradually transformed his approach from plantation management to broader social theory, eventually publishing several anonymous pamphlets on what he called social organization science. These pamphlets, circulated among Southern intellectuals and eventually finding their way to some Northern academic circles, presented a pseudo-scientific framework for social control that obscured its origins in slavery while preserving its essential techniques. As the research team continued to analyze these documents, they uncovered an even more troubling connection. Blackwood had effectively laundered his cruel methods into academic discourse, where aspects of his thinking influenced early sociological and psychological theories about labor management, crime and punishment, and even family structure. By 1870, Blackwood was corresponding with academics and politicians, presenting himself as a theorist of social organization rather than a former slaver applying techniques developed through cruelty. His ideas, stripped of their explicit racial content but retaining their focus on psychological dominance, found their way into discussions of factory management, prison reform, and even educational theory. Dr. Montgomery found evidence that Blackwood's ideas had influenced at least two prominent Northern industrialists who adapted his family separation threats to control immigrant labor in their factories, threatening to fire family members if workers joined unions or demanded better conditions. One letter from a Pennsylvania factory owner to Blackwood in 1872 read, "Your insights on maintaining workforce discipline through family interdependence have proven most valuable. When Slavic workers began organizing last month, we simply dismissed 3 ringleaders and made it clear that their relatives' positions depended on their departure from the community. The effect was immediate. The organization effort collapsed within days. I would be most interested in any further refinements to this method you might suggest." What emerged from this correspondence was a disturbing picture of how techniques developed in the context of chattel slavery had been adapted and normalized in other settings, creating long-lasting patterns of control that extended far beyond the plantation system itself. The collector in Charleston also possessed a final document of particular significance, Blackwood's last will and testament, modified several times between 1868 and his death in 1873. The will contained an unusual provision. "My personal journals, ledgers, and correspondence related to plantation management are to be preserved in their entirety and held in trust by my solicitor, Mr. Orgrove, to be released only to those who demonstrate appropriate understanding of and appreciation for the scientific principles contained therein. It is my belief that while our particular institution may not have endured, the human insights I have developed remain valuable to future generations who must manage the natural hierarchies of mankind. This provision explained why Blackwood's documents had remained in private hands rather than public archives for so long. They had been deliberately preserved and selectively shared with those who were sympathetic to their underlying principles. The collector in Charleston revealed to Dr. Montgomery that the documents had passed through a network of individuals who had maintained Blackwood's legacy in various forms, adapting his techniques of control to new contexts while preserving his core insight that controlling family relationships and community bonds was the most effective way to dominate people who might otherwise resist. The man I acquired these documents from in the 70s told me they represented the true science of social management, the collector explained. He presented them as if they contained some kind of special wisdom. It was only when I actually read them that I realized the horror of what they represented, a deliberate system for breaking people psychologically that had been passed down and adapted for over a century. By February 2025, Dr. Montgomery's expanded research had begun to trace threads connecting Blackwood's techniques to various systems of control throughout American history, from labor management practices in company towns to certain approaches to prison discipline to methods used to break up indigenous communities on reservations. The research suggested that while Blackwood was not necessarily the originator of all these approaches, he had been an important node in their development and transmission, systematizing techniques that might otherwise have remained intuitive and ad hoc, and creating an intellectual framework that helped them persist and adapt long after slavery had ended. This expanded understanding of Blackwood's influence prompted Dr. Montgomery to broaden the scope of the Broken Bonds Project, examining not just the immediate impact on families separated under his system, but the longer historical legacies of his approach to psychological control. What we're seeing is that Blackwood's ledger isn't just a historical artifact documenting past cruelty. Dr. Montgomery explained in a lecture at Howard University in March 2025. It's evidence of how deliberately techniques of psychological control were developed, studied, and propagated. Understanding this history helps us recognize similar patterns when they appear in different contexts, and perhaps interrupt their continued transmission. As the research continued, more descendants of those affected by Blackwood's policies came forward, often bringing family stories that had been passed down through generations. These oral histories frequently contained accounts of resistance that weren't visible in Blackwood's own records. The many ways that enslaved people had maintained their true family bonds despite his efforts to break them. One such story came from William Jackson, whose ancestors had been enslaved at Blackwood Plantation. My great-great-grandmother Eleanor used to tell her children about how she and her first husband Robert were separated by Blackwood and forced to marry others. But they created a secret language of quilt patterns. She would wash quilts where Blackwood could see them, hanging specific patterns that sent messages to Robert, who worked in another part of the plantation. They maintained their connection for years through these quilts, sharing news of their children and affirming their true marriage right under Blackwood's nose. After emancipation, they found each other again within months because they had never truly lost touch. Other families shared similar stories of coded songs that contained messages audible only to those who knew how to listen, of small tokens secretly passed through networks of enslaved people, of children taught to remember their true parentage through stories told in whispers at night. These acts of resistance revealed that while Blackwood had wielded enormous power, he had never achieved the complete control he sought. As spring turned to summer in 2025, Dr. Montgomery and her team made another significant discovery. Among the Freedmen's Bureau records, they found a collection of interviews conducted with formerly enslaved people from Blackwood Plantation shortly after emancipation. These interviews, conducted by a Union officer named Captain James Wilkins, contained first-hand accounts of life under Blackwood's system. One account from a man named Joseph was particularly revealing. Master Blackwood took pride in not using the whip much. He'd tell visitors that his plantation ran smooth, without much physical punishment. But what he did was worse than beating. He would call people to the big house and tell them, "You don't belong to your wife anymore. From today, you belong to this woman here." Or he'd tell a mother, "Those aren't your children now. You'll care for these children instead." He played with our hearts like they were pieces on a game board. Another formerly enslaved woman named Martha described the psychological impact. "After they took my husband William and gave me to another man, I felt like my soul had left my body. I did what they told me, but I was walking through life like a ghost." Some folks broke completely, stopped talking, stopped caring if they lived or died. Others kept some secret piece of themselves hidden away where Blackwood couldn't reach. I kept a small cloth doll William had made for me, hidden in my mattress for 6 years. Touching it at night reminded me that what we had was real, even if Blackwood said it wasn't. These first-hand accounts provided crucial insight into both the devastating impact of Blackwood's practices and the various ways people had resisted his attempt to control their inner lives completely. The interviews also revealed an aspect of Blackwood's system that hadn't been explicit in his own records, the way he had used religion to reinforce his reassignments. According to several accounts, Blackwood had required the plantation preacher to perform ceremonies for these forced marriages and to preach sermons on the duty of slaves to accept their master's arrangements as God's will. As one formerly enslaved man named Elijah recounted, "Preacher Williams would tell us, 'Your master's will is God's will for you. If Master Blackwood says this woman is now your wife, then that is the Lord's doing.' But many of us knew better. We had our own prayer meetings in secret, where we asked God to reunite our true families someday. We never believed that God approved of what Blackwood was doing, no matter what the plantation preacher said. This manipulation of religion added another layer to understanding how Blackwood had attempted to control not just the physical reality of the people he enslaved, but their spiritual understanding as well, trying to remove even the comfort of believing that God recognized their true marriages. By July 2025, the research had expanded to include medical and psychological dimensions. Dr. Tanya Wilson, working with descendants who volunteered for her study, published preliminary findings suggesting that the trauma of family separation under Blackwood's system had created patterns of attachment difficulties, anxiety, and depression that could be observed in families generations later. "What we're seeing is consistent with our understanding of intergenerational trauma," Dr. Wilson explained. "When severe psychological trauma occurs, it doesn't just affect the immediate victims. It changes family dynamics, parenting styles, stress responses, and possibly even gene expression in ways that can transmit aspects of the trauma experience to subsequent generations." Her research identified specific patterns among descendants: heightened vigilance regarding relationship security, difficulty trusting authority figures, and in some cases a tendency toward emotional detachment as a protective mechanism. Many participants reported having struggled with these issues throughout their lives without understanding their possible historical origins. As one participant shared, "I've always had this feeling that relationships are fragile, that people I love could be taken away at any moment. I've been called clingy in relationships, always needing reassurance that my partner won't leave. Learning about my family history, about what happened to my ancestors at Blackwood Plantation, was like finding a missing puzzle piece. These aren't just my personal issues, they're echoes of a historical trauma that affected my family line." This psychological dimension added crucial context to understanding the full impact of Blackwood's system. not as a historical curiosity, but as a trauma whose effects continued to reverberate in the present. In August 2025, the research took yet another turn when historians discovered connections between Blackwood's techniques and certain institutional practices that persisted well into the 20th century. They found evidence that Blackwood's ideas about using family separation as a control mechanism had influenced policies at certain residential schools for Native American children, where family separation was similarly weaponized to break cultural connections and enforce compliance. A government memo from 1907, discovered in National Archives research, contained disturbing echoes of Blackwood's thinking. The attachment of the Indian to his family unit presents the chief obstacle to proper assimilation. Experience has shown that children separated from parents and tribal influences adopt civilized habits more readily. Superintendent Morris's approach of strictly limiting family contact has proven most effective. Students who maintain minimal connection to their families show marked improvement in both academic performance and behavioral compliance. Further research revealed that the referenced Superintendent Morris had corresponded with a protégé of Blackwood's in the 1890s, suggesting a direct line of influence from plantation management techniques to indigenous boarding school policies. Similar connections emerged in research on certain orphanage systems, prison management approaches, and even some corporate labor control strategies used in isolated mining and lumber communities into the 1930s. In each case, the fundamental insight that Blackwood had systematized, that controlling family bonds gave tremendous power over individuals, had been adapted to new contexts while maintaining its essential character. By September 2025, these expanding connections had transformed Dr. Montgomery's research from a focused study of one plantation's practices into a broader examination of how techniques of psychological control evolved and persisted throughout American history. What had begun as historical documentation was becoming an urgent conversation about recognizing and interrupting patterns of control that continued to operate in various forms. Understanding Blackwood's system helps us identify similar dynamics when they appear in other contexts, Dr. Montgomery explained in an interview. Once you recognize the pattern, the weaponization of human connection as a control mechanism, you start to see it in places you might not have noticed before, from certain child welfare policies to immigration enforcement approaches to corporate culture. This isn't to equate these modern systems with slavery, that would be inappropriate, but rather to recognize how techniques of control can evolve and persist in less visible forms. This evolving understanding prompted new questions about healing and repair. If the trauma of Blackwood's system continued to affect descendants generations later, and if its techniques had influenced broader systems in ways that continued to cause harm, what would meaningful redress look like? In October 2025, descendants of those affected by Blackwood's policies organized a conference titled "Breaking the Pattern, Healing Historical Trauma and Recognizing Ongoing Harm." The gathering brought together historians, psychologists, legal scholars, and community leaders to discuss approaches to both historical understanding and contemporary healing. Dorothy Williams, the elderly descendant who had shared her family's oral history earlier in the research, opened the conference with powerful words. Blackwood thought he could break our families forever. He thought he could control not just our bodies, but our hearts. But here we stand, the proof of his failure. Our ancestors found ways to maintain their connections despite everything he did. They remembered each other. They searched for each other. They passed down their stories so we would know the truth. Now it's our turn to remember, to heal, and to make sure these patterns of control are recognized and stopped wherever they appear. The conference developed recommendations for educational initiatives, psychological support for descendants, and policy changes to address systems that continue to use family separation as leverage for control. from certain immigration enforcement practices to aspects of the child welfare and criminal justice systems. As the research continued through the fall of 2025, evidence emerged that Blackwood's techniques had not only been adapted for other contexts, but had occasionally been rediscovered independently. A troubling suggestion that the fundamental insight about using family bonds as control points represented a recurring temptation for those seeking to dominate others. This pattern of rediscovery pointed to the importance of maintaining historical memory, of understanding not just that certain abuses had occurred, but how they had been systematized and justified so that similar patterns could be recognized and resisted when they re-emerged in new forms. In November 2025, the Smithsonian exhibition on Blackwood's ledger was expanded to include these broader connections, tracing the evolution of his techniques through different historical contexts and highlighting both the persistence of these patterns and the consistent resistance they had encountered. The expanded exhibition, titled "Broken Bonds, Unbroken Spirit, Resisting Psychological Control from Slavery to the Present," became one of the most visited installations at the museum, prompting difficult but necessary conversations about historical trauma and its legacies. Visitors often reported powerful emotional responses to the exhibition, particularly to the section displaying artifacts of resistance, the small tokens, coded messages, and secret systems that enslaved people had used to maintain their true connections despite Blackwood's efforts to sever them. One visitor's comment, recorded in the exhibition's response book, captured this impact. "I came expecting to learn about a historical atrocity, which I did. But what will stay with me is the incredible resilience shown by people facing unimaginable cruelty, how they found ways to preserve their human connections despite a system designed to destroy them." It makes me think about what forms of resistance might be needed today when family bonds are still sometimes weaponized against vulnerable people. As the research continued into December 2025, Dr. Montgomery and her team began the process of making all their findings publicly accessible through a digital archive, ensuring that the full story of Blackwood's ledger and its broader implications would be available to researchers, educators, and community members worldwide. The digital archive included not just the historical documents, but the oral histories, psychological research, and analyses of continuing patterns, creating a resource for understanding both historical trauma and its contemporary echoes. In the final days of 2025, as the research project approached its 2-year mark, Dr. Montgomery received an unexpected email from a historian in Brazil who had been following the Blackwood research. The email contained images of a document found in the archives of a Brazilian coffee plantation, a Portuguese translation of what appeared to be one of Blackwood's anonymous pamphlets on social organization science, suggesting that his techniques had spread internationally. This discovery opened yet another dimension of the research, pointing to transnational connections and the possibility that Blackwood's methods had influenced plantation management practices beyond the United States. As the new year began, it became clear that what had started as the discovery of a single ledger hidden beneath plantation floorboards had expanded into something much larger, an ongoing excavation of how systems of control had evolved, adapted, and persisted across time and place, and of how people had consistently found ways to resist these systems and maintain their human connections despite enormous pressure. The story of Blackwood's ledger was far from complete. New connections continued to emerge. New descendants came forward with family histories, and new understandings developed about the long shadow cast by his systematic approach to psychological torture. But alongside this troubling history, another story had emerged. One of extraordinary resilience, of people who had maintained their sense of family and community despite deliberate attempts to break these bonds. who had found ways to resist even when resistance seemed impossible, who had remembered and searched and rebuilt connections that were never supposed to survive. This dual legacy of systematic cruelty and remarkable resistance continued to unfold in the present, challenging us to recognize both the persistent patterns of control that shape our world and the equally persistent human capacity to maintain connection against all odds. As visitors stood before the memorial erected on the former Blackwood Plantation grounds, reading the names of those who had endured his cruel system, many reported a strange sensation, not just of connecting with a painful past, but of recognizing patterns that continued to operate in the present. And in that recognition lay both discomfort and possibility, the chance to interrupt cycles of control that had persisted, often unrecognized, for generations. The final entry in Dr. Montgomery's research journal, dated December 31st, 2025, read, "As we close this phase of the research, I'm struck by how what began as historical documentation has become a living conversation about power, trauma, and resistance that connects past to present. Blackwood's ledger is not just a record of past cruelty, but a key to understanding patterns that continue to shape our world and the ways people have always found to resist them. The enslaved people whose marriages Blackwood tried to destroy, whose families he tried to break apart, would perhaps find some justice in knowing that their stories are now being told, that their resistance is being honored, and that their descendants are working to recognize and interrupt similar patterns of control wherever they appear. The ledger that Blackwood kept to document his power has instead become a testament to his ultimate failure. For here we are, generations later, still telling the stories of the families he couldn't truly break, still tracing the connections that survived despite everything he did to sever them. In the end, what endures is not his system of control, but the human connections he failed to destroy. Connections that persist through memory, through story, through blood, and through our continued commitment to recognizing and resisting the patterns he helped create. As night falls once again over the former Blackwood Plantation, the whispers that some visitors report hearing on the wind might indeed be the voices of those who endured his cruelty, not cries of anguish, but whispered messages of resistance, passed from one separated loved one to another, maintaining connections that no system of control, however calculated, could permanently sever. For in the end, what Blackwood never understood, what those who follow in his footsteps never understand, is that human connection runs deeper than any system of control. People find ways to remember, to resist, to maintain their bonds, even when every force is arrayed against them, and in that persistence lies both our most painful history and our most hopeful future. Turn to Jesus Christ, for only He can heal the broken bonds of our past and present. Only in His love can we find the strength to resist the patterns of control that continue to threaten our humanity. For as His word tells us, there is no fear in love, but perfect love casts out fear. Let us hold fast to this truth as we work to recognize, resist, and heal from the patterns revealed in Blackwood's terrifying ledger. Patterns whose shadows still fall across our world today. The truth is never fully buried. It waits beneath floorboards, in hidden journals, in whispered family stories, in the silent spaces between official histories. And when it emerges, it challenges us to see our world anew, to recognize both the persistent patterns of control and the equally persistent human capacity for connection that defines us at our best. The question that remains for each of us is simple. Now that we know, what will we do with this knowledge? How will we honor those who resisted Blackwood's system by recognizing and interrupting similar patterns in our own time? The ledger has been opened. The story continues, and we each have a role to play in how it unfolds from here.